everyone. Welcome to another lovely edition of Room for Discussion. Now, today we're going to be swapping out our traditional balance sheets of banks for the battlefields of history. We're going to be exploring how a small Dutch colony on the edge of a wild continent grew to be what we now call the bustling global city of New York. And our guest is especially equipped to take us on this journey. Russell Shorto is a journalist, historian, and an author of several acclaimed books, his most recent one being Taking Manhattan. His work shines light on the Dutch origins of the American identity, ideas of liberalism, tolerance, and trade, and how they made their transatlantic journey into the New World.
But we'll also talk about how some of these stories have been forgotten and often buried by historians through the ages. From messy colonial politics to multi-ethnic marketplaces, we'll dive into these stories and more in the next hour. Please welcome Mr. Russell Shorto to our stage and sit back and relax. Enjoy, whether you're a history buff, a New Yorker at heart, or just here for a good story.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks very much for having me. Hello, everyone. This is gezellig.
So when people think of New York these days, they maybe picture skyscrapers, the Statue of Liberty, Seinfeld, Friends, maybe a 99-cent slice of pizza if you can still get those, but probably not the Dutch merchants of the 1600s. Yet through your work, you've shown how New Amsterdam's origins still shape the city as it is today. What first pulled you into this story?
This is my second book on this topic. The first one, The Island at the Center of the World, came out in 2004. And so I guess you would have to go back 27 years ago. I was living in the East Village of New York. My daughter, who's now 30, was a toddler, and the nearest open space that I could take her to run around in was the churchyard of St. Mark's in the Bowery, which is on 10th Street and 2nd Avenue. And the tombs of some of the early New Yorkers are kind of flat on the ground, and I kind of like the idea of a little girl running around and playing among these tombs. And but Peter Stuyvesant's tomb is flush with he's buried. It was originally his family chapel, and there's a plaque there which I've later realized has, I think, 4 errors on it of fact. But I knew Peter Stuyvesant's name. I knew New York was once New Amsterdam, but I knew almost nothing else. And I was interested, and I've learned about myself as a writer that I tend to be drawn towards origins. I want to get to the root of it. And so I asked a friend or two who were historians of New York about the Dutch period, and they kind of said the same thing. They kind of said, I don't know the Dutch stuff. That's beyond me. And then and that intrigued me. And then someone said, you should talk to this man, Charles Gehring, who I then looked up. He started in 1974 in Albany, upstate New York, translating and publishing the official archive of the colony of Nieuw Nederland. So the colony was this huge area of the eastern seaboard. It encompassed all or parts of New York, New Jersey, some of Connecticut, some of Pennsylvania, and then the capital, New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island. So I talked to him. I had 3 phone calls with him. The first one was just really disorienting in an interesting way because I knew so little, and he was, telling me all these new things. So then I called him back, and then after the third call, he said, why don't you come up? We're having a conference. They have an annual conference. His organization, it's now called the New Netherlands Institute. And he said that, come up to the annual conference, and I went to Albany for it, and there were, I don't know, maybe 100 people in the audience, and there were different panels and historians, and they're, giving talks on things like Dutch foodways in the Hudson Valley, 1652 to 1673, or something, academic, narrow, interesting, but it's like, I'm trying to, isn't there a bigger picture here, So eventually I thought, I would write something about it. And I originally thought I would write a magazine article. And I contacted an editor I knew at the New Yorker, and he came back and said, how about a talk of the town? And talk of the town is a section of the New Yorker which has little tiny, like one column tidbits of information. And I'm thinking about it, and I said, I can't fit, it's a big story, I can't fit it into a talk of the town. And one of those rare, gratifying moments for a writer, after The Island at the Center of the World came out, he sent me an email saying, you were right, it was not a talk of the town. But that, was so I wrote that book, and that was my attempt to explore this whole topic of this colony, which I had known nothing about, and tell its story. That's what. And then this is maybe a sequel, but it's well, you can tell me if it's a sequel.
I would say like your latest book, Taking Manhattan,
Yeah.
seems to have a very layered, a much more layered approach to writing history, right? We'll get a bit more into it later in the hour, but how did writing this book push you to rethink the assumptions you had about New York, or even how you approach history itself?
Well, this book adds a layer. For one thing, I've learned it was interesting for me to have done something 20 years ago and now revisit that topic. So this book is about the last days of New Amsterdam, and really about this takeover, this battle, this standoff between the English and Dutch, which would literally result in New York. And in looking at that, I'm revisiting the same material, the material of that colony, that city, and that era. And I've changed, because you change, and the world has changed, and I've changed with it. So it's like you take a familiar object that you have on your mantle, and if you turn it a different way, you're like, oh, or if you turn your picture upside down or something. So there's some of that. I think the main thing for me is that both the world at large and I look at that era of the 17th century and much more in putting emphasis on issues of colonialism, slavery, dispossession of native people than I did. I mean, I treated those things in the earlier book, but now it's like they're front and center. So that was a real different orientation.
Was there a particular moment in which you thought you have to rethink your approach to historiography, and that pushed you in this direction?
Well, no, it was the reason I wrote this book, the new book, is that I've remained part of this translation effort, connected to it. I'm a senior scholar at the New Netherland Institute. So I've always been, since I wrote the earlier book, I've been attached to it, following the effort to publish the records, and these are official records of the colony. They're court cases and council minutes and correspondence, and sometime in the past 5 or 6 years, as Charlie Gehring and others who are now translating have focused on the last couple of years in the life of the colony. I mean, this was a really vibrant, unique place, New Amsterdam. It took these elements that the Dutch had developed here, and they took on different character there. And as you get to its end, you see it as this vibrant kind of little Wild West port town, but with these Dutch features. It had windmills and canals and things. And all of these traders, there were about 1,500 people. Everybody was a trader. They famously spoke 18 different languages. And they have connections to the Caribbean, to South America, to different parts of Europe. So I realized in these last couple of years in these records, you now can see New Amsterdam sort of the way the English saw it when they sailed these warships into the harbor saying, we want this thing. So we're now seeing it as this fruit that has ripened. So I thought, okay, what if I focused on that moment of the takeover? So that was what brought me into it. And then once I was into it, I was like, okay, I really am looking at this material differently from the way I had in the past.
Well, you kind of already touched upon it, but with the life in the settlements itself. But how would you contrast the life in the settlements with Amsterdam in the 17th century, when it was really going on as a full city, with culture, with tradition, with trade? what was the differences between the two areas?
Well, this is a little outpost on the edge of, quote, wilderness.
Yeah.
It was just, and people in their correspondence will refer to that, the vastness, and Adrian van der Donk, one of the most prominent settlers, would write home and describe everything in America is bigger. The animals are bigger and more ferocious, the trees are taller, the crops grow bigger. So you get that sense from them of we're living in, and they were very aware of course, they went there originally to trade with native people. So they were quite aware of this intricate native presence all around them, which of course then in time becomes tragic as there's various conflicts that develop. But in between those conflicts, there is trade and there's understanding of various sorts. And they had a pretty good understanding of, so the area around New Amsterdam, that whole area of what's now New York City and into New Jersey and to the south, was the Munsee people, otherwise known as the Lenape or Delaware. Out on Long Island, you had different people, the Shinnecock, the Montauk. Further north, you had the Mohicans on the east side of the Hudson River, and then you had the Five Nations of the Haudenosaunee to the west. And these were all different languages they spoke and different customs. And there were people within the colony, Dutch and other Europeans, they were doing business with them. They knew at least some of these languages. They knew the differences. They knew when the Mohicans and the Mohawk were at odds with one another. And so it was this very complex cultural story, and they were right in the middle of it.
Well, New Amsterdam, as you kind of already touched on, really getting ahead of the questions here, but New Amsterdam was very diverse, right?
Yeah.
It was very multi-ethnic as a settlement, but the contributions of Africans and Indigenous and other communities at the time were often overlooked.
Yeah.
And how did the Dutch interact with groups beyond just the Indigenous here? And how does your latest book set to explore that area?
The challenge of, for example, dealing with, the story of Africans, the story of slavery in this colony is a really interesting one, and it's complicated, and you really want to get into it. And the frustration is, and this is true more broadly, that the records that we have are by and large written by the Europeans, by the Dutch, and they're telling the story from their side. So the story of slavery in the colony is the first enslaved Africans arrive, I guess you would say by accident. The Dutch were at war with Spain, and in 1626, a Dutch ship captures a Portuguese ship in the Caribbean and takes aboard 22 Africans whom the Portuguese had enslaved. And they had heard, presumably, that there was this new settlement on Manhattan Island, so they go north and they drop them off. And so this was a year after New Amsterdam got started, so the people there are like, okay, we have to incorporate these people now. And so slavery begins there. And it was an ad hoc affair throughout most of the life of the colony. Other enslaved Africans arrived on similar circumstances. It was the way we think of slavery now. It was not that. They seem to have, in inventing slavery, they seem to have looked at the Bible because there was slavery in the Bible. They looked at ancient Rome because there was slavery there. And I think there was an element of indentured servitude because there was several times groups of Africans petitioned for their freedom after a number of years. So there's this thinking that, like with indentured servitude, that you don't have a contract with a term, but there's this idea that after a period of time, I've earned my freedom. And they're then granted freedom. But, it's not like, oh, they're free and everything's great, because there were these weird strings attached. So the stipulation in one case was, we'll grant you your freedom, but we may take your children back into slavery. So it's like putting this little rope around the neck there. You're not going to go too far here. And then you look at things like the Africans who were there had come from parts of Africa that had been colonized by the Portuguese. They probably grew up Catholic, so they were already Christianized. They were part of the Dutch Reformed Church in New Amsterdam. Their children were baptized there. There are one or two instances of marriage between Africans and Dutch. So you just have to put all these pieces together and then try to figure out what the story is.
Yeah. On that train of thought, you also write about the arrival of 290 enslaved Africans on the Gideon, highlighting the darker aspect, as you kind of already touched upon. What role do you think the Dutch and the slave trade had in minimizing the public understanding that we have of it today? And how does that contrast with this Dutch idea of tolerance?
What do you mean minimizing the public understanding of what?
As in, we don't really hear about this initial enslaved parts of a new initial enslaved history of New Amsterdam.
Oh, well, as I say, I think it was not a prominent feature. It wasn't part of the. They didn't go there saying, all right, we'll set up a slave colony and we'll have a trading base and all that. It came sort of by accident until in 1659, the directors here in Amsterdam write to Peter Stuyvesant, the director of the colony, and say, we want you to experiment with a consignment of Negroes. That was the phrase. And so he sets this in motion, and it takes a while to get something like this off the ground. And this, what you refer to, this first large shipment from Africa arrives in the harbor 2 weeks before the English arrive. So when the English arrive, and this is the story I tell in Taking Manhattan, you've got the English in their ships in the harbor, loaded with weapons and with their cannons pointed at this little fort, and the Dutch are in the fort with their cannons pointed, and this, complex, and it's about to, explode. You have to factor in that there's 290 Africans who are like, what are we doing here? And, so that's, and Stuyvesant, for his part, he's the one that engineered this, but now he's got a crisis on his hands, he's got guns pointed at him, and there's like a food shortage in New Amsterdam at the moment, and he's got 290 new, so it's like this is the worst possible time to deal with this. But, when you're trying to explore the history and tell the story, you've got a few data points. I always think history is like, writing history is like connecting the dots. You've given these dots, and now you have to pull them together to make sense of this.
Like the red thread.
Yeah.
And one of these dots you write about is the story of Dorothia Angola, one of the first enslaved African women in New York. And to some degree, I think her story challenges the notion of black life in Amsterdam, of one of just purely bondage, as you mentioned earlier. What does her story reveal about early African life in North America?
Yeah, well, I write narrative history. I believe in storytelling. I think that's a meaningful way to do history. I think it's the oldest way. Telling stories is how we get meaning. And so I don't, in this book, approach the telling of the story of the African story in New Amsterdam in a textbook way. So I used one figure from the period, Dorothea Angola, to do that. And she arrives probably, we don't know for sure, but probably in 1627 as part of this group that I was talking about who kind of accidentally were brought there. She marries another African. They then are part of a group in 1644 who petition for their freedom. They're granted their freedom. They are given land. They're given 6 acres of land in Manhattan, not out of the goodness of anyone's heart, but because they have to pay off annually their freedom in the form of crops. So they need land to do that with. And her husband dies. She remarries. She has children. She has grandchildren. And her land is a couple miles north of New Amsterdam. And so I'm, pulling these data points together and to the extent that I can, telling her story. And you have to figure that with all these things being considered, by the time of this moment when the English are in the harbor and it's about to become New York, she's a person of some substance. You know, she's probably in her 60s now. She's got this whole family around her, and this area that, so she has 6 acres, and the people around her, those parcels of land were also given to freed Africans. So this became known as the land of the blacks, and I was actually kind of plotting her land on the map of New York City today, and I'm looking at the streets, and there's like Sullivan, Thompson, McDougal, Bleecker, and I realized she owned Greenwich Village. And so then I was watching A Complete Unknown, the Bob Dylan movie, you know, about...
Great movie.
What's that?
Great movie.
Yeah, great movie. And Greenwich Village of the 1960s is really like a character in the movie. And, you know, so then I'm thinking you'd have like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, people like that, singing these songs about freedom and justice in the 1960s. And her story, 3 centuries before, on that same land, tells that same story in this very elemental way. So it's just amazing, some of these, that sometimes, you know, you can't make this stuff up.
Yeah, and another one of these data points, another one of these stories, I think, about the limits and the enforcement of toleration, right? You talk also about Asser Levy, one of the first Jewish settlers in New Amsterdam. He faced fierce resistance from Stuyvesant, who tried to bar Jews from military service and deny them rights as equal citizens. Can you walk us through that legal battle a little bit and how that also reflects this broader story?
Yeah, some Dutch people today want to think that there was never such a thing as Dutch tolerance or toleration. There was. It was limited. It obviously did not apply to enslaved Africans. It didn't apply to Indians, native people who were dispossessed. It basically applied to white European Christians, and yet that's something. And Jews were a different category. There was some toleration of them. I think Peter Stuyvesant, as the last director of the Dutch colony, intolerance was the prevailing view in most of Europe, and it was common sense. You know, it's a dangerous world, and if we're to survive, we have to pull together. We have to be on one page, and religion is this divisive force. So we should have a state religion, and we should, encourage people to be part of it or get them out of here. And I think that's how Peter Stuyvesant viewed things. I think he was, he was an intolerant European at heart, but he was the director of a colony that was overseen by a nation that had this policy of toleration. So repeatedly, Stuyvesant tries to block certain minority groups from settling, and a couple of different times, including in the case of the Jews, Asser Levy became sort of the leader of this small Jewish community. They appeal. They write to the home country. They write here, and they say, we think we have a right to stay. And he's overruled. The directors tell him, yeah, there is this policy of toleration. You have to let them stay. But nevertheless, he still tries to make it unpleasant for them. And, from his perspective, it's, I have this settlement in the middle of nowhere, and we've got all these problems. We've got issues with native people. We've got the Swedes are threatening to come and take a portion of the colony. The English are all around us. So he would love to have a colony of people who are all speaking one language and having one religion, but he has to put up with it. So he'll do things like he said, okay, the Jews have to stay here, but I'm going to tax you as burghers, as city residents, as city citizens, but you don't have any of the rights of city residents, of burghers. So Asser Levy, on behalf of the Jews, appeals this and says, either don't tax us as burghers or give us the privileges of being burghers. And so that's a battle that plays out, and he's forced to give them burgher status, and then they get to like march in the civic guard, sort of like in the Night Watch, marching around New Amsterdam and things. So those little battles play out that test this notion of tolerance, and that's anywhere in history you see notions of civil rights. Okay, we have laws that say, that the laws sound great, but then people are pushing back against it, and then people push against that, and so this is, you see that play out time and again there as well.
Come back to the underlying battles of these ideas and ideologies in a moment, but I want to ask you how you begin your book, actually. You begin with the contemporary story of Chief Vincent Mann and Picaro talking about the survival of Lenape people. Was that a deliberate choice to center this version of history?
Well, sure, it was deliberate. I started the book with it.
But what was the thinking behind it? Why did you choose to center this?
I think I was guilty of, and a lot of other people, a lot of Americans are guilty of thinking, okay, whether it's the Dutch in New Amsterdam or the English in New England or whatever, there was this ugly mistreatment of Native people, and that was in the past, and those people are long gone. The Lenape, or Munsee people, are still there. They're still some are in Canada, some are further west in America, some are in New Jersey, and I run a center at the New York Historical called the New Amsterdam Project, and I was working on a museum exhibit on New Amsterdam, and I wanted to have Lenape involvement, and so I reached out to different communities, and I got to know Chief Vincent Mann and his wife, Micheline Picaro, and I went and met with them, and I thought that was an appropriate way to open the book, because this group is called the Ramapo Lenape, and they're right across the river in New Jersey, the Hudson River, from Manhattan. And from their land, you can, from some parts of what was their homeland, you can almost see the skyscrapers of Manhattan. And Micheline actually said to me at one point, we're still here, just 30 miles from where we were all those years ago. So I thought it was appropriate and nicely disorienting to people to start by saying, look, this was their homeland, and they haven't gone anywhere. They're still here. We still haven't, we as Americans, and maybe the Dutch too, still have not processed that and integrated it into, and that stands in for, because the taking of Manhattan in 1626 by the Dutch was, you might say, the first of this hundreds and thousands of takings that constitute the story of America's westward spread.
And would you say this complex dynamic that you see of race, power, identity in New Amsterdam still resonates with contemporary American society? Are there any lessons that have been taken or not taken?
Yeah, I think a lot. I mean, I think there are at least two different groups that would answer that differently, and but many people feel that yes, we've never digested, integrated, figured out how to deal with this issue, and the fact that there are native reservations all over the country speaks to that. The fact that there are millions of native people who are integrated into American society all speaks to it in a different way. I thought it was amazing that the largest population of Indigenous American people in the U.S. today is in New York City. 180,000 people live in the 5 boroughs. So they're obviously they're going on with it and processing it in their own ways. But as a society, yeah, I think no, we haven't done that.
On that note, I think it's a good time to turn to the audience to see if there are any questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and someone will bring a mic straight to you. We have one right in the front row over here.
Hi, thank you for coming, first of all. You've talked a lot about tolerance, and I was thinking, in the early 20s of last century, of course, there's been big waves of immigration into New York as well, with the Italians or the Irish. and this sort of like idea that there's a initial intolerance, but they sort of like persevere through, is something that you also talk about now. Do you think this is sort of like a common thread you see throughout history? And is it maybe because of, again, what was happening 300 years before?
I think tolerance and intolerance is a common thread throughout human history, since the dawn of time. And we are in a moment now in which, intolerance is suddenly, in fashion again. And how do we respond to that? That's what a lot of people right now are suddenly feeling like, God, we have to go back. We're doing this again. Throughout American history, you brought up New York in the 19th and 20th century. I mean, my ancestors came from Italy, from Sicily, in the beginning of the 20th century. And so I wrote, my book previous to this one was very different for me. It's called Small Time, and it's about my grandfather who I was named after, ran the mafia in my hometown in Pennsylvania. And I knew this growing up, but I always, I was told we don't talk about that, so I didn't think about it. And then several years ago, an old relative said, why don't you write a book about it? So I did, and it was really interesting learning about it was his parents who came, and seeing what they faced, the discrimination they faced, the mayor of my hometown at the time ran for mayor on this campaign that he promised not to employ Italians in anything, not even as street cleaners. So that was a sense, because they came in the millions. They were brought in the millions, and that had to do with, it was connected to the end of slavery. So there were all these, initially it was plantation owners in Louisiana who first put out the word, because the Risorgimento in Italy in the 1860s, unified Italy, and that increased suffering for Southern Italians because the North was dominant. So there was all this poverty in the South, and that coincided with the emancipation. So starting with plantation owners and then coal mines, put up posters in the streets in southern Italy saying, come and we need workers. So that's why these great waves come, and because they came in great numbers, then there was this backlash and the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, and you had, huge thousands of Klansmen marching in parades in Washington, D.C. and things. So, you see this ebb and flow, and we're right back there again now. So this is it's our world, and we have to deal with it.
Do we have another question from the audience? Got another one right here in the front row.
Hi, I wanted to ask, because it's very clear that this is something that you're so passionate about, but I think the broader public doesn't necessarily engage very much with historiography, and it's a topic that isn't top of mind for a lot of people, and you touched upon it as well. I think it also relates to our attitude towards our history and reconciling or a lack of acknowledgement of what's happened. So I'm curious to hear about what made you want to really bring this story to the broader public, and what that experience has been like of trying to get people to engage with it.
Well, as a writer, I just have to be intrigued by a story, and it has to just get me, and then I have to live with it for a while to say, do I really want to spend years devoting myself to it? So that's the core of it. And then I hope that as a writer who approaches history in the form of storytelling, I looked for a conflict. Conflict is, two people who are opposed to one another. In this case, as I said, the English ships and the Dutch fort, and they're pointing their cannons at each other. And then once you have that, which is naturally interesting, you can back up and tell, well, what was going on with the English, and who in particular, who was on this ship, who was leading this, and on the other side, and this whole mixed community. And then you can start to wrap this wider story around it. And then I have to hope that some other people are going to be interested in it too. And I start with, just talking to people around me, my wife, my agent, and bouncing it off them, and then my editor, and it goes from there. And as to what you said about people, maybe most people not being interested in history, certainly in historiography, I think that's what we're living through right now speaks to the need to try to engage people in these things, because not having a sense of history is what allows us to be taken over. If you have so I think when you're doing history, when you're reading history, it's important to look at the flaws, the failures of the past, because otherwise you're never going to process them. But I think it's equally important to look at things that we, even though they're flawed, have value in them. And in that value, that's what we stand on. That's our foundation. So when we have battles to fight now, that's the firm ground that we can stand on. So that's why I think it's important to try to make it appealing, if not necessary, to people to read about it or to watch YouTube videos or however they're gonna get it.
Thank you for that. In your 2014 book, Amsterdam, moving a little bit back towards the ebb and flow of these sorts of ideologies, you argue that the policies of religious tolerance, free trade, and social liberties in the 17th century Dutch Republic fostered this kind of innovation and cultural diversity. Why Amsterdam? Why did they take place here, of all places?
I think, and this, I'm relying on others, it's not my notion, that you can look at geography. There's one school of thought that looks at geography as creating certain conditions, and the different geography of the Dutch provinces and how that contrasted with the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe in the Middle Ages was essentially, if you think of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, you had knights and castles, and that's the reason that movie was funny, but was because it was a really pretty good depiction of that. Where economically speaking, you have a manor, and a manor is an estate, which is vast, and it's owned by a nobleman who is beholden to the king and the church, and then under him are these many people who live and work on that estate. Peasants, farmers, maybe they're carpenters or lawyers or whatever, scribes, whatever. But the important thing about it was it lasted for hundreds of years, and it was a fixed system. So whatever level you were born into in that system, your children were going to occupy that same rung. And here, because of geography, things played out differently. So people came to this part of Europe much later, Rome, Athens, these are, ancient cities. And it was really in the Middle Ages, for the most part. There were some Roman settlements, but otherwise, it's in the Middle Ages that people began to settle in the Dutch Republic, or in the Dutch provinces, and the Kromme Rijn in the center of the country. And in 1122, that's the first place where waterboard formed. And people said, okay, we're tired of being flooded every spring, because this is a river delta that we're living in. We'll start building dams and dikes to control the water. And that had this cohesive act to it, and that's creating polders, creating land from the sea, and the need to act together, and it was a need because otherwise we were underwater, creates a different kind of society, and it also creates new land, and that new land is parceled out to people, and people become landowners, and they use the land to to grow crops and sell them or have a dairy industry or whatever. And so they start to get wealthy and they realize they can make life different for their children. And that contrasts with, the Monty Python and the Holy Grail of the rest of Europe. So that sets off this cycle of innovation, and that leads to the fayose and a new form of capitalism long before the word would come into being. And that leads to this international travel and speaking other languages. And also you have at the same time this 80-year war of independence against Spain and this battle between, and there's always a left wing and a right wing in any society. And the right wing, as the Orthodox always do, they said, no, we know the mind of God and God wants us to do X. And then the left wing in this case said, well, that's what the Spanish said when they sent the Inquisition here and they burned our cities. So maybe we should be a little bit more humble about thinking that we know what God wants. So maybe we should tolerate other differences. So I think those are kind of some of the ways in which history molded this society and set up Dutch cities, and Amsterdam in particular, to be different. And then that gets transplanted to New Amsterdam, and then that becomes that story.
So would you say that at its core, New York's current identity as like a dynamic, diverse, very entrepreneurial city comes at its core from the original cohesion that was formed by making those boulders?
That's what I think what I try to do is capture ideas and watch how they spread. And it's really impossible, I admit that, because you can't capture an idea, but you can try to follow it, and that's what I am sketching out, exactly what you said. Like, isn't that fascinating that maybe, because we don't know for sure, but maybe, these people who in 1122 in on this little body of water in the center of the Netherlands started something, and then Manhattan skyscrapers, and I think it's fascinating to watch that develop, and then to look that, okay, in the 19th century, huge waves of immigrants come from Europe to America, and mostly they land in Manhattan. And they look around and they see these buildings going up and all these people speaking different languages, and they say, oh, this is America. But it wasn't America yet. It was New York, and it was New York because it had been New Amsterdam. But maybe they stay for a generation and their children move west, and they bring some of that with them. So again, that idea moves west, it moves eventually to California, So I like trying to capture that idea as it spreads.
Do you think there was any point at which New York kind of diverged as it was evolving from the Dutch ideals?
Sure, everything diverges. There's all kinds of influences. I mean, so taking Manhattan is about the moment. The argument in taking Manhattan is that this standoff, these were enemies, and they had just fought a war, the Dutch and the English, and this act would actually set off a new war. So there was every reason to think they were going to go at it here. It was going to come to violence. But instead, and this is really kind of what I get into in the book, and I get into the personalities of Richard Nicolls, the leader of the English, and of Peter Stuyvesant, as well as the Dutch community, because it was people like Dorothea Angola who played a role in this decision. What they come to through negotiation, through sending messengers on boats back and forth and learning about each other, is realizing that they have quite a bit in common, and that it would be better for everyone on the ground if they could create a kind of merger. That's what I refer to it as. It wasn't in the best interest necessarily of the people in the home country. The Dutch were mad as hell when they thought, you did what? You gave it away? But for all the people on the ground in this community, it was advantageous because they knew that they had tried for years to get the Dutch government to support them, to give more settlers and all that, and they were ignored. So they were on their own. And Richard Nicolls knew that the Dutch were doing something unique in New Amsterdam. And he wanted it. He didn't just want the real estate. He wanted this combination of, what they were doing. So the terms that they hashed out were like a Bill of Rights. They're promising you'll keep everything. You'll keep your trade networks, ships keep coming from the Netherlands, and notaries here for decades kept sending settlers to New Netherland. It was New York, but they just kept calling it New Netherland. So that meant that you had this Dutch base, these Dutch features fused, which by design they wanted to keep that going, but it then became attached. The name was changed to New York, and it became attached to the rising British Empire. And how New York benefited was, although nobody at the time recognized it, the Dutch Empire was starting to wane, and the British Empire was just getting going. So then it kind of transferred at the right time. Yeah.
Why do you think? Why do you think this particular moment in history that you call a world-changing event that's been curiously skipped over, this English takeover of Manhattan? Why do you think this pivotal moment hasn't been quite embraced in the American collective memory, say the same way Plymouth or Jamestown has?
Yeah. It's curious that that Peter Stuyvesant is well known, and Richard Nichols, who's the winner, nobody's ever heard of. And that was exciting to me as a writer. I like the idea of, here's this figure who's quite consequential and nobody's heard of him. I can develop him. I think American history has always been told from the perspective of New England, the Puritans and the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving and all that. That's a very English story, and I think those were the first printing presses in America were in New England, and the first books told the story of the generation before, their fathers, who were the Puritans who came from England to New England and had this idea that, because we're succeeding, that means God favors our endeavor, and therefore God gives us this right to the whole continent, so we're going to start moving. So that became the dynamic. The New York story, underneath it being the New Amsterdam story, is a messier one. It's all these different people, and that's always been, if you look at other pivotal moments in American history, the American Civil War, the American Revolution, New York's relationship to those events is a strange one, and I think the broad answer to why that's the case is that it's not one answer. You've got all these different communities. You have a consistent Dutch minority. You've got the English story. You've got French and Huguenots and all these different things. So it's harder to tell that story. That's one reason.
Now, as we're sort of coming towards the end of our interview, kind of established the Dutch origin and the foundational ideals that helped set up New York. If you could indulge our curiosity a little bit, what would New York look like if the Dutch didn't give the city up? If they stayed there, they held their feet in, purely hypothetically.
Yeah.
What would you say it looked like?
Hypotheticals are always kind of like science fiction to me. It's like, okay, what if we're all wearing, I don't know.
Tinfoil hat.
Yeah. We'd be speaking Dutch right now. I think, the history always, we tend to look at events in the past as inevitable. Of course, the Allies were going to win the Second World War, but maybe they didn't. A few things happened differently. Trump won by 1.5% of the popular vote. That's not much. What a different world this would be. So we look at, American history has looked at that moment, to the extent that it has at all, as inevitable, that the English were going to be stronger, and of course they would just roll over the Dutch. But the Dutch had, Peter Stuyvesant had to go back and face trial for giving up the colony, and he got affidavits from Dutch soldiers who said, we were ready to fight, and we're trained soldiers. We looked across the East River, we saw all the English lined up who were going to oppose us, and there were farmers from Long Island, and they're just holding, pitchforks and things, and we could have taken them, So yeah, it could have happened that way. I guess there would have been this, if the Dutch then had the Dutch here had picked up on that and reinforced that colony, maybe you would have had these two growing European settlements in the New England and then the Dutch, and they would have been very different. What happened though, we didn't get into this much, but the English who Richard Nicolls represented were the anti-Puritans. They were the so-called royalists. They were the moderates in England. They were the pragmatists. They were the ones who founded the Royal Society. So they were, that's what I say when I say that they, in these negotiations, they thought we can get along with these people, these Dutch. So once they create New York with this Dutch base to it, it becomes a kind of ideological center of relative pragmatism and moderation and factionalism and multi-ethnicity, whereas Boston, the center of Puritanism, becomes an ideology of theocracy and nationalism, and we have a right to this continent. And those two competing ideologies, so even though the one became English, in a way it was still Dutch, and so those competing ideologies have shaped American history ever since. That battle is still going on, and it's, to this day.
We spent a lot of time unpacking the complex history of New York, of the Dutch origins, of its impact on the US more broadly. I mean, you've clearly spent years in this field, as you've mentioned earlier, but including more public roles like the John Adams Institute right here in Amsterdam. And through this all, you seem to have the same sort of argument that we need to see the past in the clear light of day rather than trying to attempt to reconcile pride and shame. Why is it so crucial to interpret history in that way? Well, what do we gain from it as a public?
I don't know. The alternatives are to have this whitewashed view of history, which maybe is a stronger thing in the short term. It powers us forward in a certain way, but then the past eventually comes. And this goes for individuals as well as societies. If you don't face your demons, they're going to come back at you somehow. So I don't see an alternative. And I think different periods of history, we try that. And I think in American history right now, there's this effort to say, forget the past. Let's just start with now. I think, I don't think in the long run that gets you it gets you into any good place.
How can we push back against that sentiment?
I just think you have to keep you have to be honest about this, and I'm someone who believes that history is really important because, as James Baldwin said, history is trapped in us and we are trapped in history. And if you're not aware of that, then you're really trapped. And at least if you're aware of it, you can start clawing yourself out to see the light of day.
And with that beautiful sentiment, we have unfortunately come to the end of our interview. Firstly, just want to say thank you so much for your time and for this lovely conversation. We also say thank you to all of you.
Yes.
So for everyone here, let's have a quick round of applause.
Thank you.
And if you enjoyed our interview today, you'll be excited to hear that we have two upcoming ones next week. On the 9th of April, between 1 and 2, we'll be having an interview with the economist and author Steve Keen, who is known for his unorthodox approach to economics.
And on the 11th of April, also from 1 to 2, right here on our stage, we'll welcome Stéphane Dougan, CEO of the Cyber Peace Institute, for a conversation about how they provide cybersecurity for the most vulnerable and hold threat actors to account for the harms they cause. For now, that's all, folks. Thanks again to you, Mr. Shorto, for joining us, and thank you to all you as well.
Thanks, everyone.